Someone did ask me to ask you where they can buy haunted items if they want.
Where they can buy haunted items? It's it's not the easiest trade because a lot of people could just be scamming. Usually it depends on what school you belong to because people at different schools are going to have different ideas about what is constituted as being haunted or something. There is a market for these things. There's most popular in this field are these museum curators whose name is escaping me right now. Nathan from church has talked about them before. And they're this married couple. And they're like the most popular collectors of haunted objects. And sometimes they'll sell some of these objects out of their curation cycle. And they have a museum, I think in Louisiana, maybe somewhere in the South, where they have some of the most haunted items known to exist in America. You could also, if you're just really into it, you could just go steal an object off a haunted place, you know. Again, this depends on the school you're a part of.
What type of places would be haunted?
Some schools say like you can't just take an object from a haunted place, you know. So, but it depends on the person. I guess who's asking this question.
How would you find like a place that is confirmed to be haunted? Like how would you know that?
Confirmed by whom? Like whose standard are we using Ripley's Believe It or Not, or a poltergeist? You know, like a ghost expert or a psychic?
If you're using like just poltergeist or whatever, I feel like it's pretty easy.
Or if you were to do this, if you wanted to acquire a haunted item, how would you go about doing that?
I'd probably send a message to my exorcist friend, actually, the one who you all wanted to come here, the paladin. Even though I only half trust him about what he says, and that's generally the nature when you're working with people in these sort of fields. He could probably lead me to the right places. Okay. I mean, as far as like haunted, I stayed in one of the most haunted hotels in America, which is in Eureka Springs, and it's right next to what's supposed to be the most haunted. What was really cool is that this whole town, it's the most beautiful town I've seen in America. And it's built on this slope, like a very steep slope. And it's the only church in North America where you enter through the bell tower, which was St. Therese of Lisieux church. I went there. It's a really pretty church. And it's right next to the most haunted hotel in the United States. And the story behind the hotel was there is this guy. So the place grew up. The Native Americans sold it to us because it had this magical healing spring property. And people would go there for baths and, you know, to get better from sicknesses, lifelong illnesses. And yeah, Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And it's a popular like tourist destination. It's a small town. They have this law where like all the architecture has to be unique. They don't have like any like McDonald's or anything. And so like everything's its own individual small business. All the hotels, there's no chain hotels. All the hotels are individually owned and they all have their own styles and thing going on. So like it feels like you're in a European town almost because there's not this mark of like late capitalism there. And it's so cool. And, but it's also a destination for people who are into haunted stuff. And it attracts a lot of motorcyclists. They have a lot of good restaurants. Anyway, the guy was like basically a scam artist, and he was like, oh, I can cure cancer. And he would inject them with like something poisonous, like mercury, so they would die. But he, in order to avoid getting caught, he would lock them in the patient room. So they would all just die this miserable death. And he just kept doing this, making a profit until he was caught and sentenced to jail. And, but he still had like killed like 200 people or something. I don't know. It wasn't that much, but it was a lot. So now this hotel is supposed to be, it was a hospital turned into a hotel. So now it's our sanatorium.
When did you stay there?
I didn't stay at that one. I stayed at one next to it. That was when I was on my way to live at the monastery in Oklahoma.
Did you see anything or feel anything? No.
My mom was with me though, and she said she did, but I didn't myself. I mean, that's all the Vatican does. They just collect all these haunted magical objects. I guess, and their from original intentions is kind of noble because it's like we should protect the public from these things. But their libraries and basements are chock full of them. If you could break into that, you'd be in, you know, haunted object collectors galore paradise. So
what type of stuff do they have?
Oh, there's so many rumors. I mean, you read about these stuff in ancient legends and things that were passed on to the Masons and then to the Vatican and then back to the Masons. Supposedly they have this, I don't know if this is true, I've just heard stories about this. They have this enchanted telescope that when you look through it, wherever you're looking at, you're looking back based on how much you clock it back in time by a certain amount. And this one is interesting because you do hear it referenced in multiple places, which is what makes it seem like even if it's not legitimate, at least a legend that had much more traction, and that it was passed into several hands, and things like Ark of the Covenant, you know, stuff like that, like all this like holy objects, or even the chalice of Christ, you know, the Holy Grail. So no one really knows for sure what they have, but they keep it very lock and shut. So they have something down there.
Their goal would be to keep it away from the public?
Yeah, or public knowledge. Even more so.
Because that has to be the one to take care of that. Real Area 51.
I don't imagine they have anyone who cares. My impression is that in the 15 or 1600s, they locked it away very, very, very deep. And they made sure that you needed like 4 keys to it. And that to get these 4 keys, you had to go see like the Shaolin Temple in China. And you have to go to like the Pope's, underneath his toilet seat or something. And, you have to go all over the world. And they make sure no one goes in there, basically, not even the Pope. It's just like no one goes in there anymore. It's shut down. The Pope knows about it, but he doesn't.
So did they not add to the collection then? Or?
Right. So that's the next. So then it's like, well, maybe they have a second library where they put more recent acquisitions. But I don't know. At the same time, the Vatican's power has decreased so much since then. I don't imagine they have the sort of objects they used to anymore.
Mm-hmm. They're now in Louisiana.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh. Are we recording, by the way?
We are recording.
We can probably leave.
We can probably leave a lot.
We didn't do an introduction. Welcome to the 50-minute hour. That was a very long discourse on a variety of topics. Anyway, I'm drinking Four Roses bourbon.
And we've got some wine.
Yeah, no, can you tell me the origin of this wine?
Lacrima wine. So it means tears, and it was originally like Lacrima de Christi, which is tears of Christ. It was a popular wine between 15th and 17th, maybe 18th century Italy. But it sort of fell out of fashion because it was more difficult to take care of compared to other varietals of grapes. And it's not easy to find. I had to contact my local sommelier and have her order it into her store. But I did get 2 bottles of it. And this is, where's the bottle? Oh, here it is. This is the Rubico Lacrima de Mora d'Alba. And it's a 2019. And so we're having fun with a little wine history today.
Is there a special process that goes into making it?
Not compared to other wines. It's just the grape itself is more sensitive, kind of like Pinot Noir, except Pinot Noir, it's so popular that all these techniques have developed. This has only very recently come back into fashion, and it's just a bit of a challenge for vintners to get the hang of. I'm sure now that it's back in fashion, they will get a hang of it, but it's just a very sensitive grape. It's not hardy. Yeah. You really need like Mediterranean conditions to grow it. That would be interesting if they tried growing it in California, which has somewhat similar climate. But as far as I know, I don't think they've done that yet. I think it's only in Italy.
All right. So what is today's topic, Corey?
I think we were still trying to figure out what. I think we want to continue somewhat on the topic of psychology, and particularly the industry of psychology and why it's trash. Why I decided ultimately to not become a psychologist, or at least in the sense that I'm like getting paid for it. Yeah. And maybe anything else that comes out of that. I don't know.
I think that's a good topic. To start off, you made the statement it's trash. Why exactly do you believe that?
It would be more or less the same criticisms I have with most institutions today, like public education, which is that it has nothing to do with education. And psychology, unless you have a good psychologist, which is about as rare as a good teacher, which is to say very rare, you're not going to have really any ultimately beneficial experience. It might make you happier by the modern idea of what happiness means, but I don't really put much stock in that. So, and it's basically what happened. There's a long history here, but the death knell was when in the 70s and 80s, psychology became dominated like healthcare with insurance. And when that happened, it became a whole new game. Your occupation as a psychologist was not predominantly research, even if you are a bad one. At the very least, you had motivation to be interested in spending most of your time actually thinking about the care of the patient, not really worrying about things like diagnoses. Not that it wasn't a concern, but it wasn't as present. Whereas now, as a psychologist, if you're taking insurance, and it's hard to operate as a psychologist if you're not, then you're forced into the situation where you have to usually diagnose your patient within the first few visits. And so the whole operation of psychology is no longer an art of healing the soul. It becomes an art of labeling this person, this entity, and sort of dissecting and diagnosing it, and then following these system of maneuvers laid out by things like the DSM about the prognosis and how to go about. So it's very much symptomatic, which is to say psychology went from being about an intrinsic value of the human person, or being, at its most ideal at least, being concerned about the foundational mysteries of the human mind and behavior. And it's shifted over to something much more medical and financial, monetary, which is sort of this Fordist system of taking in patients and churning them out cured. And basically cured by the understanding of getting rid of these presenting symptoms, which of course, if you know anything about psychoanalysis, the whole idea there is that symptoms have nothing to do with why a person is miserable. Symptoms are just presentations of a deeper root issue. And if you get rid of an issue, something else takes its place. The other thing about this whole system is that it encourages way more so fads, and very more quickly, because it's like dieting. A fad comes along, like right now the big thing is CBT. And CBT works really well for American ideology because CBT is very much the fast food of psychology. It's cognitive behavior therapy. And basically it's the most potentially symptomatic psychology you could develop, which is to say a person comes in presenting symptoms, there's something wrong in their thinking, so we're going to work with their thinking, like what are you thinking about? Maybe think about this. It's basically, and it also blends into like what was sort of the last fad, which was like Buddhist meditation. It blends very well into this idea of like, you just got to meditate, man, and chill out and get good vibes. And I'm being facetious, but you know what I mean. Like, and you have to like look at these symptoms of the person's thought and get rid of them, and then they're fine, and then they go off. And of course the problem is that the long-term recidivism rate with these things is high, but that's not really going to be a concern for someone as a psychologist who's mostly focused on keeping their license. And the other thing is that because of insurance, you're constantly getting checked up on by all these like, I don't know, meta psychologists or whatever you want to call it, who like make sure you're following these rules, and you have to go back and take classes, and it's all a money-making scheme, basically. Were you going to say something, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to actually speak on that because, so I've worked in a few psychology offices. My mother's a psychologist as well. So I've been surrounded by this, and especially modern psychology, like as it operates. And it's funny, what you said is exactly what my mother said, which she said, psychology died the day that we started accepting insurance, because it changes the entire game. And it's, you know, like you said, you know, there's a push to diagnose. It's so bad. And I think like psychologists are like the only doctors that actually this is an issue. Whereas if you as a patient come in and you see a psychologist and they don't really have a diagnosis for you, the psychologist won't get paid by insurance. So you have to walk out with something like with a diagnosis on you, even if it's bullshit. And because if not, the psychologist just wasted their time. They won't get reimbursed.
Yeah.
So I actually was a billing manager for a while in an office. And we had one particular psychologist, and she was a little older, so she was a little bit more old school. And she wouldn't diagnose her patients very often. It was my job that like, if the patient walked away from the first session and I didn't see a diagnosis put on their file within like 24 hours, I had to go to her office and get a diagnosis right then and there. And there was this whole thing between us. She was very nice and we had a good relationship, but there was a whole thing between us where I would constantly have to tell her, it doesn't matter, just put something. You know, and so the big one that the psychologists use when there's like nothing wrong with you is like adjustment disorder. Yeah. So it doesn't really mean anything. It means you have problems adjusting to whatever. So I would always like tell the psychologist, I would say, everyone has adjustment disorder. Everyone you see has adjustment disorder if you don't have something else for them. You can change it later on, but they have adjustment disorder. And so it is a big scam. And then, like you said, on following up. So then what you do is you get audited by these insurance companies and they want records and notes of treatment plans. Well, so it's
and not just insurance companies, other psychologists who work in tandem with these guys who are like, oh yeah, take a class on like, you know, some bullshit human adequacy or identity order thing.
Yeah, so it's sort of, there's a twofold thing there. One, to keep your license active, you know, you have to take certain classes every couple of years or whatever to keep your license active. So that's one side of it.
Sure.
I mean, being a psychologist is basically being an insurance agent at this point.
Right. And insurance agents have counselors or people who technically have some degree that work for them. And then they look at your notes, having never met the patient, and are seeing whether or not they think this person is suitable for treatment. So it's just so formalized. And psychologists spend so much of their time now writing notes, writing these kind of bullshit treatment plans. Because like, what even is a treatment plan if you're trying to do anything psychoanalytic? And so, and this is what you were saying with CBT, which is the bane of a lot of, it's very popular in kind of...
Americans love CBT.
Yeah, in average, like, layman, they hear a lot about CBT. It's kind of the bane of psychologists who try to do anything psychodynamic or psychoanalytic.
It's the exact opposite spectrum of psychoanalysis.
Right. So, I mean, essentially, it's like, like Corey said, it's like, well, your thoughts are illogical. It's like...
Just quickly as an interjection, there's this very potent, I think, anti-capitalist critique of it as well, which is that it's basically something like we have a worker who's not working at their maximum capacity. We need to send them to a psychologist, not to discover who they are or become a better person or a more virtuous person, but simply so we can get them working back cognitively, efficiently as a worker.
Right. It doesn't touch at all on the unconscious.
And it puts the blame that society and industrial society has on the individual. It says it's not our fault. It's not that we have this sick society. It's that we have a sick individual that needs to be cured.
And so
reminds me a little bit of old Ted Kaczynski talking about how you can now create a society in which the basic structures of the society cause people to be miserable,
yes,
and then take away the external form of
yes,
that misery simply through pharmaceuticals, yes, and just keep going deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole of a totally
altering human behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, I think you've been talking about the problems in psychology. Psychiatry is even worse. I mean, there is no talk therapy anymore. It's just you get the diagnosis and you prescribe. And if a patient comes in with a previous diagnosis from a psychologist, which might be a BS diagnosis to begin with, well, it doesn't matter. You're still going to get the prescription.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a major problem. And with CBT, what's so it doesn't even touch on the unconscious as well. Just to kind of go back.
Right. Most CBT people say either the unconscious does not exist, or insofar it exists, it has no agency. It's basically this animalistic drive that doesn't really have much. It doesn't have any intellectual capacity, and it doesn't really have any agency in everyday life. It's basically ignorable. Yeah,
and so this is a very popular form, like insurance company, and I think you've talked about this, and maybe we can talk some more. Insurance companies love CBT. It's basically, and again, not that it doesn't have its use in certain ways, but it's basically saying your thoughts are illogical. Well, and it doesn't really go a lot further than that. So it's like, why are you paying $200 an hour to hear your thoughts are illogical? Obviously, your thoughts are illogical, right? And it's sort of steps to make your thoughts more logical. It's like, that may get you somewhere. But reading, Marcus Aurelius and just reading the Stoics can get you a lot further than CBT.
But the problem is that the CBT understanding is that your thoughts are the substance of what's happening, whereas psychoanalysis, of course, or most other traditional psychology say, your thoughts are merely representational or symptomatic of something deeper that you're not probably aware of. And in this, it's basically also the essential divide here is between modernism and traditional philosophy or traditional metaphysics. Because traditional metaphysics basically says we have a part of ourselves, our soul or psyche or whatever, that is mostly unknown to us. And we only access that through deeper spiritual states like prayer or meditation or ritual. Modernity says you basically, what you see is what you get. And it's all superficial. It's all on the surface. There's not a deeper metaphysical realities behind these things. If those exist, it's this Kantian sort of like, oh, it's just your opinion, subjective in the air. It's not really have any pragmatic existence. And this is what CBT personifies in the psychology realm. It's this, that your thoughts are what you are, basically. So it's like, it's sort of like a fundamentalist reading of Aristotle, because Aristotle says, well, your thoughts become your actions become your behavior becomes your character becomes virtue, and virtue becomes destiny, or vice, right? So CBT sort of reductionistically says, oh, it's just your thoughts. And what you're presenting in your thoughts is what your problem is. Whereas traditional ideas are that your thoughts are just representing demons or spirits that are deeper in you that have to be extracted out.
Yeah,
through pharmacon.
And it's easy, and CBT is so attractive because you can put a lot of paperwork on there. There's a lot of homework that's given. That's like, and I've seen some of these, CBT manuals and books and some of these assignments, and it's like, list irrational things you thought, or it's just very kind of basic level. And in my experience, like, it's very, I don't know where people get the idea that it's so great.
It is. It's falling off the back of a series of fads that were very much influenced by the New Age since the 70s. Yeah. You sort of had Marcuse and the sexual revolution, and that from the academies, which watered down to your everyday psychologist, like, let's get rid of Freud, not entirely, but just like all the unsavory parts. And let's just make everyone like get in touch with their sexuality and be sexually liberated. And then that evolved into like New Age Eastern stuff, which was still kind of big in 2010s, which is like, we need to get into Zen meditation and all that, which is now going into CBT. So it's kind of been like the steady process.
Yeah. And I've seen a lot, actually all the time, people would come in and they request CBT. Like they would be on the phone and be like, do you do CBT? And anyone who came in, for the most part, I mean, in my experience, demanding CBT and wanting like CBT, which is kind of a crazy kind of thought to go to a psychologist kind of demand the type of therapy you want. But anyways, and if they were to be given just something that's CBT, like straight out of the textbook, they would almost always quit after like 2-3 sessions. Either that or say, I no longer want to do CBT. Because if they're dealing with anything that's really anything real, CBT is not going to get them very far.
And wanting CBT is probably a defense mechanism on their part.
Yeah.
Because they know it's not going to actually intrude into them.
Right. And so just the therapy becomes so unfocused on anything that's like, touching the unconscious, and usually people end up dropping off. And usually people, the other experience, and I think this is closely related, that a lot of psychologists, again, especially psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, is that people really come in with the idea of, I'm here to get fixed. I'm here to get well. And so they come in and they think that there's going to be some answer or some, it's like going to the doctor and getting medication. You know, I mean, they think there's something to be given to them, make them well. And they don't realize like it's so far from this mindset of that you have to like, you putting work in and you're not here to get some solution. I mean, maybe you can speak to that more, but it's like idea that why aren't I better? Why aren't you making me well? And so it's this kind of...
Yeah, it's fast food. Yeah.
Fast food, exactly. It's quick answers.
And in this vein too, it's like, even if you are a good psychologist and you see all these schools of psychology, behaviorism, CBT, psychoanalysis, object relations, whatever, you see these as tools in a toolbox and you know how to work with most people. You're so weighed down by all this continued schooling and all this insurance stuff that you can't really spend time focusing on your patients. And you always have this other thing in the back of your head you have to worry about. And it's very difficult to establish your own private clinic and liberate yourself from that.
So what, in terms of you going into that as a profession, what would have to change for you to go into that? Do you see any sort of possibility that you would ever be able to go into that? Or
there were several complications for me other than just being disillusioned with the industry. My thesis paper was controversial at the New School and led to something of a political assassination. Additionally, there's a fast track to become a psychoanalyst, which is what you get a master's, which is what I was doing in psychology. And then you go to a licensing of psychoanalysis in the state you want to practice. You can become a psychoanalyst who can practice in other states, but it's a much longer process and it usually needs a PsyD, which I didn't want to spend the money or the time for. I didn't have the money for it. And, which is another thing I'll get into about the whole money situation with psychology these days. But, so my option was to go to the only school in Kentucky that gave licensure for psychoanalysis, which was in Louisville. Right when I graduated, like that month, that school closed down. It wasn't impossible for me to be a practicing psychoanalyst, but I wouldn't have been able to be one in Kentucky. And Kentucky's where I want to be. So that became out of the question. I wasn't going to go through a PsyD, especially facing all this political turmoil at the university.
So you're not able to get licensed anywhere in Kentucky then, now that school in Louisville closed, right?
Not without getting a PsyD or becoming like a social worker and then going through this whole other. So I was talking to my Jungian professor about it, the one I mentioned in the last podcast, who was fired from the New School. So we kind of in a similar boat. Because the New School always built itself being prided on the rejects of society, and we're the rejects of the rejects. And he was just telling, I was like, maybe I could be a Jungian analyst rather than a Freudian. I was kind of trying to play into his ear. And he's like, well, that would be nice, but it's basically impossible, and you're going to be constantly berated by all these like continuing education programs. And, he knew I was from a poor background. So he's like, you won't be able to afford it. Your best bet is becoming a social worker for like 10 or 20 years, and then working your way into the system. But even then, you're not going to escape any of the problems that I know you're going to hate. And I was like, yeah, you're totally right. So I basically gave up on that idea as well. And that's the thing. Like Freud was like, he's very much like Plato and with his philosopher kings. He's very simultaneously democratic and aristocratic. Freud thought most medical students becoming therapists was a bad idea. He said most medical students, by their general behavior, no offense, Garrison. I don't think you're like this, by the way, but I do think a lot of medical students I met are like this. They're very narrow-minded. They can't really think outside the box. They want very precise monologistic views of things that don't really allow any extra room of creativity or interpretation. And Freud said generally the best psychoanalysts are going to come from people who study philosophy, mythology, the humanities, basically literature. That's where the cream of the crop is as far as what's going on in the human soul. And Freud was also very adamant, one, that people who go into analysis should not be blocked from being under an analysis because they're poor. And all psychoanalysts should be ready to use some of the money they make from their rich patients to compensate for the poor patients they take in. The second thing is that he thought anyone, regardless of where they come from in life, should be able to become an analyst. You know, just like Plato, like even a woman could become a philosopher king, or even one of a bronze soul could become a philosopher king if they have the aptitude for it. And society should bend over backwards to make them become a philosopher king. In the same way, society should bend over backwards for those who have the aptitude to be good therapists, to be good analysts, even if they don't come from a background of money, should be able to become therapists, become doctors. And Freud was very adamant that the whole system of psychoanalysis should be a school where that's ensured. Pretty much as soon as Freud's circle took over, that because they're all bourgeois. You know, not to say Freud wasn't bourgeois, but he had incidentally, despite his general skepticism, and cynicism, he had a much more humanitarian outlook about how psychology should function practically, monetarily, financially, compared to the Freudians who took over. And that's still where we are today with it. It basically, especially Jungian psychoanalysis, has become like a wine mom Oprah book club thing where it's just people with money go in to like talk about their dreams. And it really lacks the substance that anyone like Jung would have ever thought it should have.
So quick question, hopefully. We've talked a lot about like Freudian and Jungian fields. But like when we did our Freud class, we kind of branched off on like some other figureheads of like the psychoanalyst movement. Yeah. So like you have like Wilhelm Reich or whatever with like his muscular like entropy or whatever.
Repressed emotions are stored in the muscle.
Yeah. Would you say today really the only two fields we have in psychoanalysis are the Jungian and the Freudian disciplines, or would you say that there's other disciplines that are also prominent?
In America, Freud and Jung are the most popular, but there are plenty of other schools. The Kleinian school, the Lacanian school, which is my favorite, but you generally don't see Lacanians in America. They tend to be more continental.
Sure.
No, there are plenty, and there are many fields of psychoanalysis that took off in weird places like South Africa that you generally don't hear about in America. You have Bion. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, Bion or Bion, B-I-O-N. You have a lot of psychoanalysts, and a lot of times therapists won't advertise themselves as psychoanalysts, but are basically entrenched in these post-Freudians. And if you were to mention it, they're like, oh yeah, I base everything I practice off of Bion, or I do everything based off Klein. And these are, modified or object relation versions of Freud, but they are still based very deeply in psychoanalytic theory.
We've also kind of talked about previously on the podcast how you have kind of this ancient practice of psychoanalysis that takes place through like the confessional in like Christianity, but also you have forms of this in shamanism and tribalism and whatnot.
Yeah, my point is psychoanalysis is just modern shamanism.
Yeah. So given that, do you think it would be good or beneficial for, say, like priests or whatnot to be trained in psychoanalysis, or at least be given an understanding of it?
Is something, I'm glad you asked this question because it makes me think, and I will answer it, but let me say this, because the other thing that annoys me about psychology is that it created a whole new field of understanding what the human person is. And by there, Foucault gets into this too, but it sort of creates this whole new idea of what a human being is in relation to the soul and the spirit. And there's like this whole new category of mind or psyche. Sure. It's not that the psyche wasn't understood as being somewhat different than the soul per se in a lot of ancient cultures, but it was very much tied into it. And if you were a priest, and this goes with pagan priest, Christian priest, Orthodox, even Protestant, is that your role was essentially the same as any psychologist today. But now there's this trend, even among Orthodox priests, where they are hesitant to give any counseling in confession that might come across as psychological because they say, well, that's the job of the psychologist. And to me, this is so ridiculous. Now, I understand in part where they're coming from. I don't think it's their fault. There's so many holes you have to jump over now, legally speaking, that you would have never had through history. So it's not just that's the problem, but the invention of psychology was such a terrible thing, because it made this space where priests in the confessional don't really act as this. They're now like doing 20% or 30% of what they used to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's created this very disenchanted, entangled pastoral situation that history has never really had to deal with before.
Yeah.
Especially now, all the more so when modernity makes us into sick creatures, and we have to go to a priest who can't really help us on that side, or some shitty psychologist. We're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point, and I'm just thinking. I think there's a lot of poorly trained psychologists or counselors or therapists or whatever, and there's a lot of poorly trained priests. And I spent time, at a seminary, and like ideally, I think what you're saying makes sense. I think practically speaking, 99% of priests are not going to be able to be.
No, but my point is they're not trained for it or brought up in the culture for it anymore because of the invention of psychology.
But I mean, even if you were to start teaching, like, say, psychoanalysis and stuff, I don't think that most priests are going to be able to
process it.
Yeah. I mean, they're not going to be reading, but not to say they're idiots.
You don't need psychoanalysis, right? You just need an understanding of how the soul works, which is what modernity calls psychoanalysis. This information was not presented in Freudian terms for most of history. It was there through religion, through the church fathers. You don't even have to read Freud to understand Freud. You just have to read the church fathers, and you're basically a Freudian. So my point is, like, this was integrated without even, it's the same thing with like how we say in Orthodoxy, like, you don't have to literally read the Bible to understand the Bible, because if you're going to church, you're getting the Bible integrated to you in a much deeper way you would ever get it than reading it. It's the same thing as psychology, and the thing with the priesthood is that the very integration of how the patristic tradition of psychology was in everyday life, not just for a priest, but for a person living in an Orthodox culture, and then being brought up in seminary and being integrated into that life and into the church fathers, you came out a better Freudian than most Freudians trained nowadays.
Yeah, so I guess you would have to rethink education kind of from the top down. So I guess to more for your question, like, should priests be trained this way? I don't think they should, given the way that priests are just trained in general and the way that people are trained in general. I think that like you have to restructure things almost from the bottom up to even get there. And most priests aren't capable of handling especially complex things. I mean,
but it doesn't. My point is, it doesn't have to be complex. It's very simple.
Well, it goes back to that cliche, like, or whatever, about like how tradition isn't learned, it's lived, or whatever. It's the same sort of thing, I think. And so like, it's not something that like maybe understanding on an intellectual sense would be helpful to some. For a lot of people, it's just going to go over their heads.
Yes.
And that doesn't matter because as long as it's being lived, it doesn't matter if they fully comprehend or like understand, what's going on.
Yes, it's as Pascal says, that the heart has its reasons that the mind cannot understand. That these things are so deep that no matter how complex, it's rocket science to the mind, but it's a lullaby to the heart, to the interior man. And that was what was integrated in cultures traditionally until modernity. And that's what you walked away with understanding. You don't have to read psychoanalysis to understand what's at heart of psychoanalysis.
Sure. And I mean, that's a good point. I would struggle to think that, that would be ideal. But
I'm not saying we should teach pre-psychoanalysis.
I know what you mean.
My point is that they didn't need to be taught it for most of history.
Yeah. I don't have much more to say on that.
I mean, my critique is one that's radical in the sense that you can't do what I'm saying without getting rid of modernity and industrialism.
Exactly,
if you can't fix the system. You basically either go the Ted Kaczynski route and actively destroy it, or just wait for it to decay naturally, which it will. How long that'll take, I don't know. But it's a system, as Marx pointed out, cannot sustain itself. It has to decay or collapse at some point.
I don't know where we are on time, but do you want to actually pivot? Because I think that the psychology versus the priest or the spiritual father, I think part of the problem with modern psychology is that the lack of a spiritual father, elder, guru
culture.
Right. I think people try to find that in a weird way in psychology often. And psychologists, in the same way priests aren't prepped to be psychologists these days, psychologists aren't prepped to be priests, you know? And so I think you run into troubles if you're trying to turn your priest into a psychologist. You also run into troubles trying to turn your psychologist into a priest. And it's like sometimes what's going on is more in this. Again, it's like splitting hairs because you can't really divide, like you said, the spiritual and the psychological totally. But sometimes you'll be going to a psychologist when really you're having something very spiritual that's going on. That's
well, as Jung actually says himself, and I agree with him, every psychological problem properly understood is a spiritual problem. And that's why you really can't divorce the two. The psychological, as we understand it in modernity, is a manifestation of the spiritual.
Right. So I guess if you're going, it's like, and this kind of goes back to what you're saying, kind of the splitting of the two roles. It's like, you're not getting the full picture, trying to, see it just a psychologist, seeing it, a priest or an elder, unless if you have a psychologist or an elder who really is able to actually fit both roles. But I think that's extremely rare, that they have that kind of knowledge and understanding to do that. So you're kind of being left off trying to fit, fit something in there. It's in
many ways, in the grand scheme of history, you can see it as a reiteration of the separation between the priest and king. I was thinking about this with our new cat, Melchizedek. But it's interesting that the Bible points out his being both priest and king. If you read Julius Evola, he talks about how ancient traditions understood this unification of the priest and the warrior and the king, or the Brahmin class in Hinduism, where you had if you were at the Plato class, you remember Andrew's question that he brought up in response to my saying that we moved away from philosophers as being gadflies to philosophers being an extension of the state. Well, he said, well, what about all these ancient cultures? And I was like, well, yes, but Plato was responding to that, right? This is precisely his point, though. Like, society is not a progression into the state of modernity. It's a degression. It's a degression from the state where the priest and the king and the warrior, the poet, were combined into one class. And that's the Brahmin in Hinduism. And this degenerates over time. And when we get to Plato's Republic in the class, we'll see why. But the impetus of this is that it reiterates itself in branches of decay. And now we go from priest, king, poet, and now we go from the priest and priest-psychologist. So it's like one branches off and then there's more branches and everything becomes more disassociated and atomized over time. So the decay, it's like a hydra of decay that decays upon decay. So there were other questions, though, people had since the last podcast. You brought up some earlier.
Well, there's the one about, is every religion worshiping the same God?
Okay.
We only have 6 minutes, so do you think you could cover that?
I feel like we addressed this in the Perennial podcast that was like 2 or 3 ago.
Any other questions?
But I guess I will say you just have to be very careful with that because that the language is so vague, it can mean anything. It's like in one sense that's true, in one sense it's not. If you show Muslims a picture of Christ on the cross, you say, is this God? They'll say no. You show a Christian, they'll say yes, right? So are they the same God? Well, in that sense, no. But in a different sense, yes. I think it's literally impossible not to worship God. The problem is that people have a misdirection of worship, idols or whatever. Everything is infused with the energy of God. No matter what you do, you are worshiping. And no matter what the object of your worship is, what you're worshiping in that object is what you desire in God. But that desire becomes perverted and detached. And we come up with these illusions of what God is. That's idolatry in the deeper sense. Idolatry, on one level, is just literally worshiping an idol as if it's God, right? It's not like icons or like a statue of Mary. Like you think that thing itself is God. But the deeper aspect of idolatry, which is the most universal sin, is where we take things in being to be that which is beyond being. And that's what we do conceptually. We take ideas and we get tied up, like Plato says in the Phaedrus, we get tied up to these ideas. Even God is an idol. The very concept of God, the very idea of God. If you read St. Simeon the New or Dionysius the Areopagite, they'll talk about this. Even God is just a manifestation of the energia of God's being, beyond being. So you can get wrapped up in this whole idea in theology and philosophy and literature of what God is, and not actually through that. This is kind of like a misappropriation of Westernism when we say Buddhism is atheist. It's not really atheist. If you talk to actual Buddhist monks, they're like, yes, we believe in the ultimate God. It's just when you call him God or ultimate or anything penultimate like that or anything at all, you're immediately negating him. It's like what Kierkegaard says of himself. It's like the moment you You name me, you negate me. Well, the same thing is true of God. Anything that is descriptive of God is negational. So all these religions that are coming in this concept of God, all of them already by doing so negating him, but they are sharing that eternal thirst and hunger for that being that energizes all of reality.
So let's say, in a very basic sense, there's God up in heaven, right? When Christians pray to him, they imagine their prayers kind of going up to him. Do you think at that level that every religion's prayers are going to him?
There's nothing God doesn't hear. So what do you mean by going to? God hears all prayers.
Are they directed to him even if they're through Islam?
Yeah, I don't think God takes respect to persons. And this is kind of the parable of the Good Samaritan too. It's people are incredibly flawed. We should definitely have mercy and epistemological humility on what people think about reality. And we should think of ourselves as being just as wrong. We have what we have because of what God's will has intended us to be in this situation of. If we were born in a Muslim country and grow up Muslim, that is God's will, whether it's direct or direct. But these things are confusing the substance and the matter. And the deeper thing at the end of the day is where someone's heart is in respect to God, in respect to Logos, which can shine through even better in Islam than it can in some cases of Christianity. Now, when I say that, I mean certain perversions of Christianity. But my point is like, what religion someone follows is pretty superficial to where their heart is in respect to God.
Well, I know, Garrison and I were talking the other day about how, in Islam, you have, the external jihad, which is, the war or whatever, but then you have kind of the internal jihad, which is, the jihad of the heart or whatever. So, I don't know, was there something... I forget how you described it exactly, but...
Namely that there's the external aspect of the jihad, which is, going out into the world and trying to subject the external chaos, the infidel, to the law of Allah. Mm-hmm. And it's basically the same process that takes place on the internal level when you subject the infidel within yourself to the law of Allah. And the external aspect of the jihad as an ascetic practice can actually further the internal aspect, although it might not be necessary to have literal war or combat.
Yes. The church fathers say something very similar as well. But they caution against externalizing your inner jihad to other people through judging. Right? It has to be these ideas of St. Benedict of working out your prayer, or et labora, working and prayer. So as long as you do that in a way where you're not judgmental, you very much get the thumbs up on the father of the outer jihad.
Well, it goes back to why are you worried about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own? So.
Or the story with St. Moses the Black, where he has the bag of sand and he's going along in the desert and all his brothers are like, oh, St. Moses, your bag is leaking. And he's like, yes, this is how I feel when I judge my brothers, when all my sins are pouring out before me.
Alrighty, well, that will bring us to the end of the 50-minute hour.
Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen and gentle ladies. May your inner and outer jihads both be in the will of Allah, inshallah.
We'll see you next time. 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 Next time, 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 next time. Next time, next time,